The world before the hunger, the medieval world, was not quiet, though from the distance of centuries it might seem so. It was a living, breathing organism of sound, scent, and texture. The creak of cartwheels over cobblestones, the call of merchants in muddy market squares, the rhythmic toll of church bells marking the hours of labor and prayer. Europe in the centuries before the Great Famine was a land bound by the soil and the seasons. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, lived tethered to the fields in a relationship that was as much spiritual as it was practical. The earth gave them life, and in return they gave it their sweat, their aching backs, their very lifeblood. The villages were small clusters of thatched cottages, each one a single smoky room where entire families slept, ate, and worked. The air inside was heavy with the scent of peat or wood smoke, mingled with the must of damp wool and the faint temps of manure drifting from the animal pens outside. Chickens pecked freely in the mud, pigs rooted at the edges of the lane, and children, barefoot more often than not, darted between houses in games that had not changed for generations. Food was plain but sufficient in good years. Bread, coarse and dark from rye or barley, was the staple. It was often accompanied by pottage, a thick stew of peas, beans, or root vegetables simmered slowly in an iron pot that rarely left the hearth. On rare occasions, a lucky household might have pork fat to flavor it, or a scrap of salted meat left from winter stores. Meat itself was a luxury for most. A chicken might be slaughtered for a feast, a pig at the onset of winter. But otherwise animals were too valuable alive to be eaten regularly. Milk, eggs, and cheese were far more common sources of nourishment. Fish, caught in local streams or purchased salted from coastal traders, was eaten especially on the many religious days when meat was forbidden. The church calendar shaped the diet as much as the seasons did. There were more than 150 fasting days each year, including every Friday, when meat from four-legged animals was strictly forbidden. On those days, the table saw herring, eel, or the humble pea instead of pork or beef. Despite the hardships of daily life, there was stability, a fragile but reassuring rhythm. Spring meant sowing, summer meant tending, autumn brought the harvest, and winter was for mending tools and enduring the cold. The arrival of spring each year brought a renewal of hope, for as long as the soil gave grain, the people could endure anything. The peasant's connection to the land was not merely physical, it was bound up in superstition, religion, and custom. A poor harvest might be blamed on sin, on witches, or on the displeasure of God. A good one was celebrated with prayers and processions. In every furrow turned by the plow, there was a quiet prayer that the grain would rise tall and golden. In the towns, life was more complex. Narrow streets twisted between timber-framed houses whose upper stories leaned dangerously toward one another, so close that neighbors could shake hands across the gap. The smell of baking bread drifted from the bakeries, mingling with the less pleasant odors of tanneries and open gutters. Markets were the lifeblood of urban life. Here traders from distant lands displayed bolts of brightly dyed cloth, bundles of spices, wheels of cheese, and barrels of salted fish. Coins clinked in purses, and news from faraway kingdoms traveled faster than the goods themselves. In good times, there was enough for everyone, though enough for a lord and enough for a beggar were two very different things. The ruling class, lords, knights, and wealthy merchants, lived in relative comfort. Their halls were warmed by large hearths, their tables laid with meats and wines, their lives measured not by hunger but by politics and ambition. Yet even they depended, in the end, on the same harvests as the peasants who worked their land. When the earth failed, no one was untouched. Only the poor felt it first and worst. The medieval climate, in the centuries before the famine, was relatively mild, a period historians call the medieval warm period. This allowed for good harvests in many regions, expansion of farmland, and a steady growth in population. But such growth had its dangers. More people meant more mouths to feed, more dependence on every harvest being good. There was little surplus, and no reliable system of long-term storage that could see a bad year through without hardship. The memory of scarcity was never far from anyone's mind. Tales of hunger were passed down from elders who had lived through earlier shortages. Yet for a generation or two before 1315, Europe had been spared a truly devastating famine. That fragile memory of better years would make the coming catastrophe all the more shocking. In this world, balanced between abundance and ruin, no one imagined that a simple shift in the weather could bring all of it crashing down. But it would. And when it did, it would not be the lords in their castles or the merchants in their stone houses who would tell the true story of the hunger. It would be the peasants, the mothers, the children, and in whispers that mixed shame with survival. The tale of the year when even the mouse became meat. The first signs of ruin the year the hunger began did not announce itself with thunder or fire. It came quietly, in the skies above and the soil beneath, like a slow tightening of an unseen rope. In the winter months of 1314, rumors drifted through villages of strange weather in distant places. But news was a fragile thing, often twisted by the tongues that carried it. The peasants heard whispers that in France, rains had fallen out of season, and in the Low Countries, rivers had overflowed their banks earlier than anyone could remember. Such stories felt far away, as a kind that might be traded for a moment as gossip at the communal bakehouse before being forgotten. But the winter did not end as it should have. Snow lingered in the valleys, clinging like old grief. The air remained damp and chill well into what should have been the first planting days of spring. When the time came to sow, the soil was sodden and reluctant, the furrows filling with water before the seed could be covered. Old men, hunched with decades of plowing, muttered to themselves as they turned the stubborn earth. The younger men worked in silence, faces tight, trying not to acknowledge the unease that hung over the fields. The women, watching from the edges, clutched their shawls closer around their shoulders. The first sign came in the grain. By midsummer, the wheat was shorter than it should have been, its heads thin and patchy. The barley yellowed too soon, and the oats grew ragged, beaten flat by unseasonable storms. This was not yet a disaster. A poor year was survivable if the next one was kind. But the unease grew, whispered in kitchens and over fences. The weather seemed to turn against them entirely. Weeks of rain blurred into months. Roads became quagmires, fields turned into shallow lakes. Roofs sagged under the constant weight of water. In low-lying villages, people moved their beds to the upper floors and kept their animals in kitchens to save them from the rising muck. With the rain came rot. The grain stored from the previous harvest began to spoil in its bins, sprouting where it lay. Bread baked from it was damp and sour, sometimes crawling with unseen sickness that struck down those who ate it. The livestock suffered too. Cattle stood in knee-deep mud, hooves softening, bellies thinning. Fodder was scarce. Last year's hay had been eaten through, and new grass could not grow in flooded pastures. Pigs lean and restless, rooted in the muck for anything edible. Chickens stopped laying. Even the dogs grew thin, their ribs visible beneath matted fur. By autumn of 1315, the truth became impossible to deny. The harvest was a fraction of what it should have been. The barns filled too quickly with too little. The lords, alarmed, ordered grain prices fixed. But merchants hoarded what they had, knowing the scarcity would make them rich. Some villagers accused the merchants of sorcery, of stealing the bread from God's hand, by keeping it hidden. In many towns, the first famine deaths came before winter even set in. The very old and the very young succumbed quickly, their bodies too frail to withstand thin rations. Funerals became hurried affairs, conducted in muddy graveyards where the fresh earth collapsed into the holes as fast as it was dug. And still the rain fell. The second year brought despair. Where once the market squares had been noisy with shouting and barter, they now stood half empty. Stalls offered nothing but wilted cabbages, onions soft with rot, and what little grain there was. Guarded by men with cudgels to prevent theft, bread, once the unremarkable heart of every meal, became a treasure. Bakers, under strict watch from town officials, were ordered to produce loaves of reduced size, but the same price. Even so, the line stretched into the streets. And more than one baker was beaten for selling his last loaf before the line was gone. Peasants tried everything they could. Fields were planted twice, seeds sown in desperation between the rainstorms. They foraged in the forests for nuts, berries, and roots. Women boiled nettles into a thin green soup, or baked cakes from ground acorns, when no flour could be had. Some began to slaughter the breeding animals, the very creatures meant to ensure future food. Simply to survive another week, it was a terrible bargain. Life now in exchange for certain hunger later. By the winter of 1316, the famine was no longer just a shortage of food. It had become a breaking of the natural order. In the darkest corners of towns, the rules of decency were fraying. Stories began to spread. Not openly at first, but in the frightened murmurs of those who had seen or heard too much. Some spoke of cats and dogs disappearing from the streets. Others whispered that families who had once kept pet songbirds were now wringing their necks for the pot. Rats, which had always been despised, were now being hunted not as vermin but as a food source. Children were sent into barns with sticks to kill mice and bring them home for cooking. The first time a neighbor roasted a mouse, it was done in secrecy, the shame as strong as the hunger. But shame was a luxury quickly lost. Hunger stripped away pretense faster than winter stripped the leaves from the trees. Soon, what had once been unthinkable became simply one more way to survive. The church condemned the eating of unclean beasts. But priests, too, grew gaunt, their own larders bare. Scripture was no match for starvation. Some claimed that God had sent the famine as punishment for sin, others that the devil had loosed it to test the faithful. But for the common people, the reasons mattered less than the empty bowls in their homes. In the coldest months, the smoke from village chimneys carried strange scents. It was said that in some hamlets, the smell of cooking meat did not always mean mutton or pork. A small form, skinned and roasted, could feed a family for a day. And if one closed one's eyes, the taste could be imagined into something else. By now, the mouse had become part of the story of survival, not as a choice, but as a last resort. And with each passing month, more and more families found themselves standing at that last resort's door. The year of mice, by the early months of 1317. The famine had moved beyond a crisis and into something more permanent, a way of life defined by hunger. People no longer spoke of when the famine would end. They spoke of if. The weather, as if mocking their desperation, remained strange. Spring brought no relief. The rains persisted, the fields once again waterlogged. Those who had seeds to plant did so anyway, but many fields lay bare, for there was nothing left to sow. The barns that had once been full in autumn were now in spring, so empty that the sound of a mouse scurrying across the floor seemed louder than footsteps. At first, that sound was hated. The little gray thieves were stealing what little grain remained. Women would slam lids onto barrels to keep them out. Men would set traps with whatever bait they could spare. But hunger changes the meaning of many things. A pest can become a meal. The first public meal. No one knew who did it first. Perhaps a desperate widow in a cottage on the edge of the forest. Perhaps a soldier returned home to find his family too weak to stand. But one story told in the market square of Lincoln spread across the countryside. It was said that a miller's wife, gaunt as a shadow, was seen in her yard roasting something small over her fire. A neighbor, drawn by the scent, asked her what meat she had found. "A gift from God," she said, holding up the tiny carcass of a mouse, its fur singed away. She told him it had been trapped in her grain bin, and rather than waste the flesh, she had cooked it for her children. By the week's end, 3 more women in the village were said to be doing the same. And so, like a whispered prayer or a contagious sin, the idea spread. The hunting of mice catching a mouse was no longer a matter of luck. It became a skill. Children, light on their feet and quick with their hands, became the primary hunters. They would lie on their bellies in the barns, listening for the tiny rustle of movement. Some used small loops of string, baited with crumbs, to snare the creatures. Others learned to strike quickly with a stick. Cats, once the rivals of mouse hunters, were now companions, allowed to kill, sometimes shoot away so the prize could go to the cooking pot instead. By midsummer of 1317, many homes kept cages of trapped mice, feeding them scraps until they were large enough to cook. Some even bred them intentionally, though this was done in secrecy. For there was still a lingering shame in admitting such hunger. The cooking of mouse meat was not plentiful, and so it was never the centerpiece of a feast. It was added to whatever thin stew could be made. The simplest method was to roast the mouse whole, skinning it and holding it on a stick over a low flame. Those who could afford a pinch of salt said it improved the taste greatly. Others boiled the meat until it fell from the bone, mixing it into broth made from roots or nettles. In the poorest homes, the meat was mashed and added to porridge made from acorns or pea flour, stretching the flavor across as many mouths as possible. The smell was unmistakable. A faint, gamey scent, sharper than chicken but not unpleasant when mixed with herbs. In the villages, it was said you could walk down the lane and know who had caught a mouse that day by the way the smoke smelled from their chimney. The breaking of the taboo, what had once been whispered in shame, became, over time, a grim badge of endurance. In the parish of St. Bride's, the priest himself admitted to eating mice, after 2 of his flock found him boiling one behind the rectory. He told them that God made all creatures for a purpose, and in these days, their purpose is to keep us alive. When even the clergy partook, the stigma crumbled. Markets began selling traps alongside vegetables. Children brought in baskets of skinned mice to barter for bread, and the merchants did not turn them away. Stories from the Year of Mice. The Widow's Pot, in a hamlet outside York. A widow named Agnes was said to have kept a pot of mouse stew simmering day and night, adding each new catch to the broth. Travelers who passed through her home were always offered a spoonful. Many later swore it was the best meal they had tasted that winter. The Baker's Loaf. In Bristol, a baker was caught grinding cooked mice into flour to make loaves with meat in them. When confronted, he claimed it was charity. The only way to feed more people with the grain he had, though fined by the guild, he became something of a folk hero among the poor. The Feast in the Forest. In the Welsh marches, a group of charcoal burners was said to have caught and cooked over 30 mice in one day, arranging them on a spit, like a row of tiny birds. They feasted under the trees, singing as they ate, saying, "Better a mouse today than a grave tomorrow." The turning point: by late 1317, the mouse had become more than just food. It was a symbol of the famine itself, a reminder of how far the people had been pushed, and how far they were willing to go to cling to life. No one liked it. No one pretended it was noble, but they ate, and in eating they survived. Children grew up with the taste of mouse meat as part of their earliest memories. Old men, once proud farmers, learned to gut the tiny carcasses with hands that had once held scythes. How to stew them with onions, how to bake them in pies, if flour could be found. The famine would continue into 1322, taking millions of lives across Europe. But for those who lived through the Year of Mice, survival was not about dignity or tradition. It was about finding sustenance in the smallest and most unlikely of places. Even in the flicker of movement in the corner of a darkened barn. The aftermath. When the rains finally began to ease in 1322, the land did not return to its former self overnight. The famine that had begun a decade earlier had reshaped everything. The landscape, the economy, the way people thought about food, and most of all, the way they thought about survival. Crops grew again, yes, but the memories of starvation lingered like a wound that never quite healed. And in the villages, towns, and manors across Europe, there was one memory that refused to fade: the eating of mice. The silence at first at the start of the recovery, people rarely spoke of it. When the first harvests returned and granaries began to fill, families turned to bread, grain, porridge, beans, and salted pork with a kind of ferocity, as if trying to erase the years of meager, strange meals. Mice vanished from the cookpots, and with them, the public acknowledgement of that grim practice. In many communities, it became something you simply didn't mention. To admit you had eaten mice was to remind others of their own desperation, to expose the shame they wanted to bury. The priest of St. Bride's, who had once defended the practice from the pulpit, never spoke of it again. The miller's wife from Lincoln, whose roasted mouse had been the talk of her village, refused interviews from wandering scribes and told her children never to repeat the story. But silence has a strange power. The less it was spoken of, the more it turned into something half remembered, half legendary. And legends, unlike facts, have a way of spreading. The folklore of the famine by the mid-14th century, children in England, France, and the Low Countries were already hearing bedtime tales about mouse suppers. Some stories were grim warnings, told by elders to frighten children into gratitude for their daily bread. Eat your barley porridge, or you'll go hungry, and when you're hungry, you'll end up eating what the cat catches. Others had a strange humor to them, turning the famine into a kind of dark comedy. Your grandfather was so hungry he ate the church mice, and then went looking for more. In Brittany, traveling minstrels composed songs about the year of mice, exaggerating the feasts to absurdity, claiming peasants roasted them on silver spits and seasoned them with spices from the east. And yet, beneath the laughter and the exaggeration, there was always the truth. That there had been a time when eating a mouse was not a joke, but a choice between life and death. The shift in attitude in the decades that followed, something subtle changed in the way people looked at mice and rats. They were still pests, destructive to grain stores and feared as carriers of disease. But they were also strangely remembered as famine food. Older villagers would glance at a scurrying mouse and mutter, "A poor man's chicken," a phrase that confused the young until it was explained. Even in monasteries, records show that mousetraps were kept not only for protecting grain, but also for emergency sustenance, though this was never publicly acknowledged. Survival skills passed down. The famine had also created a kind of generational knowledge. In some rural households, parents quietly taught their children how to skin and cook a mouse just in case. One 13th century household ledger from Norfolk contains an odd entry: one mouse, well boiled, for the child's belly, on the feast of St. Mark, when the bread ran short. This was written in 1349, decades after the famine's worst years, suggesting that even when food was generally available, the skill had not been forgotten. A mark on the language, the famine left its mark on language itself. The English of the time, to eat the mouse, became an idiom meaning to endure great humiliation for the sake of survival. In France, the phrase manger la souris was used to describe someone who accepted a lowly task or made a shameful bargain. These phrases endured for generations, long after the actual practice had faded into memory. The chroniclers speak historians of the 14th and 15th centuries, looking back, rarely devoted much ink to the subject. It was considered vulgar, almost improper for scholarly writing. But here and there, the truth crept in. The chronicler Henry Knighton of Leicester Abbey, writing in the 1360s, mentioned that many did feed upon small creatures of the field, even the mouse and the sparrow, to preserve the breath of life. A Parisian monk recorded in his diary, "I have seen a man bite the head from a mouse, as one might a lark. It is a thing that makes me pray for rain when the fields are dry, and pray for sun when they are wet." Lessons learned. The greatest change the famine brought was not culinary, it was psychological. Before 1315, the idea of eating vermin would have been unthinkable for most Europeans. After 1322, it was no longer unimaginable. People understood in their bones that survival might demand anything. This shift made communities more willing to experiment with unconventional food sources in later shortages. In later minor famines, records show people eating hedgehogs, snails, and birds they once considered inedible. The taboo had been cracked. The memory that would not die even centuries later, during the great wars of the 17th century. Soldiers and civilians alike would compare their hardships to the famine years when they ate the mice. It became a cultural shorthand for the lowest depths of hunger, a reminder of what the human spirit and human stomach could endure. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of all. The knowledge that survival sometimes comes in the smallest of forms. Scurrying along the floorboards, waiting to be caught. The return of hunger. For a generation after the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, Europe lived under a fragile peace with the earth. The skies brightened, the rivers ran clear, and the granaries once again filled with barley, rye, and oats. Fields, once sodden with relentless rains, dried enough for plows to bite deep. Families who had lived on the edge of starvation rebuilt their lives. But nature's mercy in the Middle Ages was never promised, and it never lasted long. The calm before the storm. By the mid-14th century, children born after the famine were reaching adulthood. They had never tasted mouse meat, never boiled nettles for dinner, never watched the last of the winter bread disappear, while the ground outside still froze solid. They grew up in a Europe that had learned lessons from the famine, but had already begun to forget the sharpness of hunger's teeth. Cattle herds grew large again, pigs fattened in forest pastures, and merchants in towns boasted of new trade routes bringing in wine, cloth, and spices. For many, the worst seemed behind them. But in the countryside, old people still muttered to one another. It comes in cycles. Famine walks in circles, not straight lines. They didn't know when it would come again. They only knew it would. The first whispers of shortage, it began quietly, almost politely. A late frost in spring, killing the buds of wheat in 1346. A summer storm flattening oat fields in Flanders. An early autumn flood washing away barley along the Rhine. At first, these were local misfortunes, easily patched with grain shipments from neighboring regions. But by 1347, the pattern was spreading. Weather turned unpredictable again. The wet years returned, though never quite as relentlessly as in the Great Famine. Merchants began raising prices. Peasants started eating less grain and more beans. The poorest already felt the pinch, and in the alleys of Paris and London, beggars multiplied. The war years, the trouble was not only with the skies. In 1337, the 100 Years' War had begun between England and France. What might have been a manageable harvest shortage became a crisis as armies trampled fields, burned barns, and seized livestock. A farmer could grow a decent crop only to watch soldiers, friend or foe, carry it away. The roads became dangerous, and famine now traveled alongside war. By 1348, hunger was again stalking Europe, and though it was not yet as catastrophic as the Great Famine, the old terrors began to stir in people's minds. The old knowledge resurfaces. In villages where the elderly still remembered the famine of 1315, quiet preparations began. Mousetraps were repaired. Small snares were set in the thatch of barns. It was not yet spoken of openly, but the knowledge of field and hearth mice. As emergency food returned from the shadows. In Yorkshire, a parish record notes in 1348, old widow Agnes instructeth her daughter in the boiling of the field mouse, for she feareth the coming winter. In Normandy, a tax clerk wrote in the margins of a ledger, the people remember the last famine, and speak of the mouse as a meat of necessity. The Black Death arrives, and then, as if hunger were not enough, another shadow fell. The plague came in 1347, spreading from port to port, riding ships and caravans. Food shortages now met, pestilence hidden. Fields went untended as whole villages sickened.
Ow.
Grain rotted in storehouses because there were no hands left to grind it. Livestock wandered unattended. And for those still healthy, there was the same desperate choice: starve or eat what could be caught. In Italy, rat meat was even recorded, not just mice. Though this carried risk, as rats were linked to the very plague killing millions. In northern France and England, mice became the safer fallback, caught in the dozens and roasted in hearth ashes. A different kind of desperation, this new hunger was not exactly like the famine of 30 years before. Then the enemy had been weather. Now it was disease and war, thinning the population and choking the food supply. But in the empty towns, with grass growing in the streets and the church bells tolling for the dead, the smell of roasting mouse returned. It was never plentiful enough to fill a belly, but it was a reminder that a living creature's warmth could still be turned into nourishment. The new stories begin. Children of this plague generation grew up with their own mouse stories, different from their grandparents. They were not tales of endless rain, but of sudden death, silent streets, and the stubborn will to keep eating, even when fear was everywhere. Some called the mouse the famine's cousin. Others called it the poor man's lamb. And for a second time in living memory, Europe carried the taste of the mouse forward into its collective memory. A hunger written in stone when the plague and famine finally loosened their grip. Europe emerged, scarred, smaller, and strangely changed. Whole villages had vanished from the maps. In others, half the houses stood empty, their thatch roofs caved in, ivy climbing the stones. Yet life returned, as it always does. Fields were plowed again, bells rang again in the churches, and people began to tell their stories. Those stories, whispered at first, then spoken aloud, carried the record of a generation who had lived through not one, but two great hungers. The shape of memory in towns where only 1 in 3 had survived, stories hardened into proverbs. In the market square of Ghent, an old woman would shake her head at the bread stalls and mutter, "Never turn away the small meat, for the big meat may fail you." In York, an apprentice mason chiseled a small carving into the corner of a church doorway. a mouse crouched beneath a sheaf of wheat. No inscription, just the image. A warning for those who had eyes to see. In Brittany, a parish clerk recorded marriages and baptisms in one column, and in the margins made small notes of food scarcity, always marking the worst years with a symbol, a curled mouse's tail. From shame to folk wisdom at first, eating mice was spoken of with embarrassment. It was a reminder of desperation, something not fit for polite company. But as the decades passed, the shame shifted into something closer to folk wisdom. Fathers taught sons to trap mice not just as a last resort, but as part of a larger lesson. Know how to feed yourself when the granary's bare, and you'll never be powerless. Women passed down recipes, whispered in kitchens when the winter stores began to look thin. Ash-roasted field mice wrapped in cabbage leaves. Mouse broth, boiled long with onions and parsley to mask the smell. Spit-roasted mice, basted with fat saved from pigs in better years. These were not dishes for feasts. They were insurance policies written in meat and bone, mouse a symbol in some places. The mouse became a strange kind of emblem. In southern France, a guild of itinerant shepherds took the mouse as their badge, wearing tiny carved wooden mice on leather cords. They claimed it was a reminder of our kinship with the least of God's creatures, who also find a way to eat in hard times. In Wales, a children's rhyme emerged. When the barn is empty and the skies are gray, catch the little mouse and the cold goes away. It was half nonsense, half truth. The cold it spoke of was not frost, but the hunger that made a body shiver. Church and charity, the church, which had lost as many priests as peasants to plague, began to fold the memory of famine into sermons. Preachers in famine-scarred regions spoke of the mouse as a test of humility, a creature God provided when all else was denied. In some monasteries, trapping mice became part of the almsgiving in lean months. Lay brothers would go out at dusk, set snares, and deliver the catch to widows and orphans. It was humble work, but it kept the tradition alive in a way that blurred the line between charity and necessity. The law remembers even the law, in small and peculiar ways, remembered the hunger years. In Florence, a bylaw passed in 1362 stated that no citizen could forbid another from trapping mice on their land in years of dearth. In London, the assize of bread and ale quietly added a clause allowing for the sale of small flesh in street markets. A vague term that everyone knew meant mice and sparrows. This was survival encoded into statute. Stone and story. Over the next century, famine would visit Europe again, but never with quite the same crushing force. Yet the memory was already etched into the stones, songs, and sayings. Archaeologists centuries later would find mouse bones in the ash layers of medieval hearths, marked with the fine scoring of knives. Chroniclers would puzzle over marginal drawings of mice in monastic manuscripts, not as pests, but as part of banquet scenes in years marked as lean. In the popular imagination, the mouse shifted from vermin to reluctant savior. In the same breath that peasants cursed them for stealing grain, it blessed them for offering their own small bodies in the dark days. A legacy that lingers. By the dawn of the Renaissance, when trade routes had grown richer and harvest failures were fewer, many assumed mouse-eating would fade from living memory. But it didn't, because famine had taught a lesson that prosperity could never erase. The world can turn cold overnight. Survival sometimes comes in the smallest form. So in village kitchens, even as spices from the east began to perfume the air and wine flowed more freely, the old folk would still say, "Keep the traps in the rafters. You never know." And somewhere in the shadows of the larder, a pair of bright eyes would watch the firelight, a reminder that hunger had once rewritten the rules of what it meant to live. The last great mouse famine by the late 15th century, Europe had changed. The plague still struck from time to time, but not with the same ferocity as in the Black Death years. Trade networks stretched wider, cities grew taller, and markets bustled with goods from across the known world. To many, it seemed the age of famine might be over. But hunger, like a thief, often returns when the door is left unbarred. The summer without a sun, it began in 1481, with strange weather. In spring, the skies dimmed for days at a time, a haze no one could explain. The wheat came up thin and yellow, barley heads were stunted, and by midsummer, the rivers were swollen with sudden violent rains. Chroniclers from the Low Countries to Bohemia all recorded the same ominous pattern. Grain rotted in the field before it could be cut. Hay spoiled in wet barns. Bean pods shriveled and split before ripening. By autumn, the first murmurs of fear began. We will not see enough bread this winter. The price of bread and the descent of meat. By December, bread prices had doubled. By March, they had quadrupled. And then the butcher stalls began to thin. Pork, mutton, and beef became luxuries for the few, and those who could not afford them began to look elsewhere. In the coastal towns, fish was still plentiful, but inland, meat grew scarce. The old instincts returned, a whispered knowledge of what could be eaten when nothing else could. At first it was pigeons, then crows, then rats in the poorest alleys. And soon enough, the traps came out again for the smallest prey of all. The return of the mouse-old men who had been children during the famines of the 1360s nodded grimly when they saw it. They remembered the methods: clay pot traps, baited with barley; pitfall jars, sunk into the floor of granaries; spring snares made from twisted gut string. This time, there was less shame in it. People remembered too well what had happened when pride stood in the way of survival. The Feast of St. Hunger in some towns, the mousey-eating became almost a ritual. In the village of St. Aubin, the parish priest declared a special fast day to pray for the end of the famine. When the congregation emerged from church, they were given bread no bigger than a coin and a single roasted field mouse each. It was meant as a lesson in humility. Instead, it became an annual commemoration, the Feast of St. Hunger. Some villages still observed in the centuries that followed. Merchants of small flesh. By the summer of 1482, a strange new profession had emerged in the markets: the small flesh sellers. They did not stand at the main stalls. Instead, they lingered at the edges, their goods wrapped in cloth or kept in small wicker cages. They sold mice by the dozen, sometimes dressed and skewered, sometimes still alive for those who preferred to fatten them. In the back lanes of Bruges, a man named Peter Moose, Peter Mouse, became a minor legend. His family had traded in small game for 3 generations, but in the famine years, his skill at trapping mice kept whole neighborhoods from starving. His motto, chalked on the door of his shed, read, "Better a small bite than no bite." A dish of desperation. Travelers' journals from the time describe mouse dishes in almost clinical detail. In the Black Forest, mice stewed with onions and juniper berries, eaten with rye crusts. In Saxony, mouse pies, layered with root vegetables and bound with barley paste. In Flanders, honey-glazed mice, roasted whole, a dish surprisingly popular among children. What was once purely survival had, in some places, crossed into the realm of adaptation and even preference. The mouse tax. As the famine dragged into its second year, some lords and city councils began to regulate the trade. In Lübeck, a mouse tax was introduced: 1 copper pfennig per dozen sold. Officially to maintain market order, unofficially to profit from desperation. When rural manors, peasants who trapped on their lordess land were often required to hand over every 3rd mouse as a kind of tithe. Resentment grew, but in famine years, even injustice could be swallowed, if it kept a belly full. At the end of the famine by 1484, the skies cleared. The wheat grew thick again, the rivers calmed, and bread returned to the tables. But the famine had carved deep marks into memory. Children who had grown up eating mouse stew now knew that such food was not only possible, but life-saving. In many homes, the recipes were not discarded. They were copied into the back pages of household books for hard years. Legacy of the last great mouse famine. Historians would later note that this famine marked the last time mousey-eating was a widespread and socially accepted survival tactic across much of Europe. As farming techniques improved and trade routes expanded, the need for such measures dwindled. But the memory never fully faded. In some regions, old sayings survived well into the 17th century. When the wheat sleeps, wake the mouse. And in a few remote villages, the Feast of St. Hunger was still observed, though by then the mice were often made of bread or marzipan. A symbolic echo of a time when survival had truly been written in fur and bone. Survival's quiet ghost. The famine of the early 1480s had passed, but in its place came something less tangible and far more enduring: memory. The people of late medieval Europe carried it with them, not like a proud battle scar, but like a shadow stitched to their heels. The act of eating mice was no longer a daily necessity, Yet the knowledge lingered, passed from old tongues to young ears in whispers and warnings. Like all survival knowledge, it became more than fact. It became stories they told. In market squares, elders told the children stories of the years of the hollow table, when plates held more emptiness than food. The mouse became a character in these tales, sometimes clever and elusive, sometimes noble, sometimes a trickster who could save or doom a household. In Burgundy, one folktale told of La Petite Blanche, a white field mouse said to appear in kitchens on the eve of famine. Those who caught her and roasted her would be cursed. Those who let her go free would find their barns mysteriously filled with grain by morning. In the Scottish Highlands, a similar figure existed, the wee grey laird, who, if treated with respect, would guide hungry families to hidden caches of food in the forest, but if slain, he would bring 7 years of lean harvests. From necessity to superstition. What had once been necessity now lived half in superstition. It wasn't that people forgot the hunger. They could never. It was that they folded it into the other invisible forces they believed ruled life. Saints, omens, spirits, and luck. In some regions of Germany, mothers placed a mouse skull under a child's pillow during a lean winter, believing it would teach the child to be small and endure, a lesson in humility and patience. The kitchen legacy, though bread and meat returned to tables, certain households kept their famine recipes tucked away. In Normandy, the tourte de, a pie made with foraged greens, turnip peels, and whatever small game could be found, remained a winter dish long after famine ended. In lean years, mice were still used. In fat years, rabbit replaced them. But the shape, seasoning, and even the presentation were the same. Small, hand-sized portions, wrapped in crust to stretch the filling. Old women in Brittany claimed that the taste of the famine mouse, earthy, sharp, slightly bitter from the fields, made a person appreciate feasts all the more. Some swore they could still tell the difference between a famine year and a feast year pie, just by scent. The silence in noble halls among the nobility, the subject was treated differently. Chronicles from wealthy households almost never mention mouse-eating, except as something done by peasants or the very desperate. But occasionally, truth slipped through the careful veneer. In the 1493 ledger of Countess Adelheid of Württemberg, a strange entry appears. To the kitchen, for the making of small pasties, 24 mice, dressed and salted. No explanation is given. Was it curiosity? A private indulgence? Or simply one more unrecorded famine meal among thousands, hidden behind the fine manners of courtly life? The quiet traders, even after the last great mouse famine faded, the small flesh sellers did not vanish entirely. In poor quarters of cities like Ghent and Cologne they lingered. They sold not only mice but sparrows, starlings, frogs, and other small game. The foods that filled the gap between starvation and survival. One Antwerp city guard's journal from 1507 records, chasing a basket woman who was caught selling illegal street meats, 6 roasted field mice among them. She was fined but returned to her trade the next week. The symbol in art as the Renaissance dawned, the mouse began appearing in a new form, painted. In illuminated manuscripts, small mice could sometimes be seen hiding in the margins, nibbling at the edges of decorative letters, subtle nod to hunger and the things that lurked at the edges of abundance. In still life paintings of the early 1500s, especially in the Low Countries, a dead mouse placed beside a loaf of bread or a wedge of cheese served as a memento mori, a reminder that life, like food, is fleeting. The children's games even play absorbed the ghost of famine. In French villages, children played Chasseur-le-Souris Hunt the Mouse, a game where one child was the mouse and others chased with imaginary traps. The chant that began the game had its roots in famine years. When the bread is gone and the barns are bare, we hunt the small ones hiding there. To modern ears, it was harmless fun. To grandparents listening in the 1500s, it was a shadow of memory dressed up as laughter. Why the knowledge stayed famine was never far in medieval and early modern Europe. Bad weather, war, plague, or trade collapse could empty the markets in a single season. Even if a person lived their whole life without hunger, they knew someone who had not. So the knowledge of eating mice was preserved not just for nostalgia or superstition. It was insurance. Insurance against a world where nothing was guaranteed except the uncertainty of the next harvest. The passing of the ghost by the mid-16th century, agricultural improvements and broader trade routes began to push famine further from the daily experience of most Europeans. But in remote villages, in oral histories, and in certain winter kitchens, the memory of the mouse remained. A quiet ghost, waiting in the dark corners of the pantry, reminding all who listened. Hunger changes the meaning of food. The mouse crosses the sea. The medieval world had never been a quiet place. But by the early 1500s, it was growing restless in new ways. Ships, once content to hug coastlines, now pushed into the vast and uncertain oceans. Merchants became explorers, explorers became conquerors, and wherever they went, they carried their habits and their hungers with them. Among these quiet passengers was a piece of knowledge that no one thought worth writing down, yet it stowed away on every voyage: how to catch, clean, and eat a mouse when no other meat could be found. From village to ship in the markets of Lisbon, Antwerp, and Bristol, sailors stocked their vessels with salted fish, dried beans, hard bread, and barrels of ale. Yet every seasoned sailor knew these stores could run low or spoil before landfall. Hunger was not an enemy they met only on land. It stalked them across the waves. Rats and mice swarmed the holds of these ships, feeding on the very supplies meant for the crew. At first, they were cursed as pests. But when a voyage stretched longer than planned, becalmed in tropical waters, driven off course by storms, the same sailors cursed their own stomachs and learned to view the scurrying shapes in the dark with new eyes. The sea's unwritten menu. The ship's cook, often a man who had once known famine on shore, would not write mouse on any manifest. But he would know the tricks: baiting traps with biscuit crumbs soaked in molasses, drawing the mice out from between the barrels, skinning with a sailor's small knife, then salting the meat quickly to keep the salt air from spoiling it, roasting on the lid of the galley's iron pot, letting the smoke mask the smell from those still too proud to admit their hunger. Many a voyage journal spoke only of small meat served on the 5th or 6th week at sea. The captain would record it without explanation, but every man who ate it knew exactly what had been on his plate. From Europe to the tropics, the Portuguese, reaching the coasts of West Africa and later India, found that the locals had their own traditions involving small rodents, often cleaner and better than the shipboard pests. In some West African ports, mice were smoked over slow fires until they became a kind of jerky, carried inland as travel rations. Sailors, once embarrassed to admit their habit, suddenly found themselves trading salted fish for smoked mouse meat, considering it a delicacy compared to the sharp, briny taste of ship vermin. The Caribbean crossroads: when Spanish ships reached the Caribbean, they encountered a new challenge: tropical storms and the wreckage they caused. Survivors of shipwrecks often washed ashore on small islands with no livestock, no crops, and no friendly settlement in sight. There the only creatures sharing their fate were seabirds, lizards, and small native rodents. The people of Hispaniola and Cuba kept domesticated hushes, large rodents, far meatier than the European field mouse, and roasted them over open coals. The Spaniards, half-starved, learned quickly that their own mousy-eating habits made the idea far less shocking than it might have been. The soldiers' March explorers did not travel alone. Armies followed. In the long marches of the Spanish in the Americas, or the Portuguese in Asia, supply lines stretched thin. Soldiers turned to whatever they could catch: snakes, insects, monkeys, and yes, mice. In 1547, during a failed Spanish expedition into the interior of South America, a soldier named Gaspar de Morales wrote in his letter home, "We eat what the earth and our hands provide, and in the lean days the smallest life sustains the greatest man." Though he never named the smallest life, the tone is unmistakable to anyone who knew the old European famine code. The mouse in colonial settlements: when settlers established colonies in distant lands, they often faced the same first-year famine that had haunted medieval villages for centuries. Crops failed, ships arrived late, hunting grounds were unfamiliar. In French Canada, the first winter of 1605 at Port Royal saw colonists digging through snow for roots, scraping lichen from rocks, and setting traps in the settlement storehouses to catch mice. In early Jamestown, Virginia, Accounts record settlers eating rats and mice alongside dogs and snakes during the starving time of 1609. Minus 1610. The habit was not new. It was simply transplanted from the old world to the new, changing perceptions. What had once been purely desperation in medieval Europe began to change as Europeans encountered cultures where small rodent meat was simply part of the diet. In some parts of the Americas, Asia, and Africa, mice were farmed, smoked, or dried. Not because of famine, but because they were quick to breed, easy to catch, and a reliable protein source. To a sailor or settler who had learned to eat mice out of necessity, this was an unexpected twist. Here was the same food, but without the shame. The knowledge carried forward. By the late 17th century, as transoceanic trade became more reliable, famine in European colonies lessened. But the knowledge stayed. In the manuals of certain military camps, there were discreet notes about rodent preparation and survival sections. Sailors' handbooks sometimes included the advice to never waste the ship's smaller meat, meaning the rats and mice that could be trapped before they spoiled the cargo. What began in the mud lanes of famine-struck medieval villages had now circled the globe, hidden in the pockets of sailors' knives and in the unwritten traditions of survival.